Welcome, everyone. Good evening, or if you're at the other end of the world, good morning. We hope that you've had a great day of demos and discussions around the digital campus and that you're gathering up lots of pocket rocks rather, to share with your fellow campers and colleagues back on campus. As the sun starts to set on Verbella Beach and the fire is crackling, I want to welcome you to tonight's Learning Human Campfire session, Digital Education and Tribal Rights. In just a minute here, we're going to be talking about tribal rights and social and racial justice, topics that are more timely and more important than ever before, with speakers who are not just the best in their fields, they're also members of indigenous communities themselves. So I'm going to ask each of the fabulous panelists tonight to just quickly introduce themselves before we hear some perspectives. So Leah Gazan, I'm going to kick things over to you first.
Buju, Heyushkawashdewi, Red Sky Woman, Indigenous, Makwa Dodem, Wood Mountain, Lakota Nation, Treaty 4 Territory, Saskatchewan. And my given name is Leah Gazan. I just introduced myself. I come from a community called Wood Mountain, Lakota Nation in Saskatchewan. In Treaty 4 territory in Canada, of course, we signed treaties. The Lakota didn't, but we've just recently had an adhesion to treaty, a long time land claim agreement that was settled recently. I just introduced myself with my name. My first name was Good Peacemaker Woman, and my second name is Red Sky Woman. I'm bicultural and interracial. My mother was Indigenous and Chinese from Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, and my father was a Dutch Jew and Holocaust survivor from Holland. And my history, certainly my family history, has guided much of my work. I'm currently a member of Parliament in Canada, and I represent a riding called Winnipeg Centre. And I'll end very briefly just to talk about my second name, Red Sky Woman. So I went fasting a number of years ago, and one of the elders gave me a name. She said, Leah, I'm giving you a name, Red Sky Woman, for all the work you're doing around advocating for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, something that's been noted as a crisis by the United Nations. In Canada. She said, because no matter where you are, no matter where we are at night, no matter what we're going through and what is happening, we all share the same sky. So I come here in solidarity and in a circle of sharing, because we're in this together. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Leah. My name is Matt Rantanen. I am descendant of the Cree Nation, Northern Alberta, Canada, around Medicine Hat. My family moved into the U.S. 126 years ago into Northern Idaho and Eastern Washington State. And I'm currently displaced in Southern California, where it's way too hot and there's no moose. So I am the director of technology for the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, 20 federally recognized tribes. I also sit on the Tech and Telecom Task Force at the National Congress of American Indians. I'm the co-chair there, along with my friend Jeffrey Blackwell. And I sit on American Indian Policy Institute Board of Directors, or Advisory Board, with Traci Morris, who you'll hear from shortly. I have the honor of doing a few other things. I advise the California Broadband Council on rural tribal issues, as well as the Western Governors Association in the same. And I've been fortunate enough to serve 2 terms on the Native Nations Broadband Task Force at the Federal Communications Commission. And I chaired the board of Native Public Media for 6 years and was on that board for 9. So I've been around policy and opportunity in Indian country for coming up on 20 years now. And have a lot to do with broadband and communications. So I'll touch more on that later. Traci?
Chukma Hachi Chukmata, Chikasha Seya, Sahochafoat, Alice, Traci Morris, and Choka Chafa, Holchafoat in Conehoma. My name is Traci Morris, and I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation. I'm also mixed. I got good Viking blood. I'm going to shout that out, warrior on both sides. I want to welcome everybody here where we are. We're on Autumn land, and we acknowledge their sovereignty as indigenous people. And I'm the executive director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University, and we're part of the Watts College. And I've been working in tribal technology and telecom and media for years now, along with Matt and other folks he mentioned as well. I'm a specialist in really the digital divide, especially, and the first time I wrote about it was in 2009 with Sasha Meinrath, and he started the Open Technology Institute. And we were the first to document the digital divide in Indian country. We were the first to write a research paper on that. And now that I'm at AIPI, we are specialists in that area as well. I brought my specialty with me, and I brought on some folks that complement my expertise at 50,000 foot with the nitty gritty. So we've recently published the Tribal Technology Assessment, the State of Indian Country, Internet in Indian Country. You can find it on our website, aipi@asu.edu. But we are primarily a non-teaching unit. We're a think tank. We're a Tribal Public Policy Institute, and we're leading the discourse on tribally informed policymaking. We translate that research and policy into applied knowledge that tribes can use. We create partnerships, working with academia and folks in Indian country like Matt. And we're serving communities through some of our capacity building initiatives, and we drive change through community embeddedness. The president of our advisory council is the governor of Gila River Indian community, and there's a number of other folks, including both Matt and Bryan Brayboy, who's on our advisory council. And so I'm going to send it over to you now, Bryan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bryan Brayboy. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe. I am the parent of two teenage boys, 16 and 18. As it turns out, technology plays a pretty significant role in our lives because of the boys, although that's not my work. At ASU, I am president's professor and director of the Center for Indian Education, which was founded in 1959. And the center actually works to meet the educational needs of children in the 22 tribal nations and communities in the state of Arizona. So I'm really glad to be here with my colleagues.
Excellent. So today we are going to have a campfire conversation around what are the larger issues around social justice and indigenous peoples, and how might issues like broadband and education play into this. Human rights and well-being, education and social justice, access and broadband, reservations, infrastructure, and systematic issues. So we're going to start our conversation off with Leah. Leah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm just really honored to be here today to share a little bit with everyone here. I call myself the Canadian neighbor, and I hope I can contribute things to this conversation that are worthwhile and of benefit to this group. I wanted to talk about one of the Supreme Court cases that occurred in Canada with the Haida Nation. And the judge at the time defined what reconciliation is. I mean, right now, certainly in Canada and the United States, certainly as was discussed in the beginning, we see very tense relationships, certainly between members of the BIPOC community. And this is what he said in terms of how to achieve reconciliation. He said, the objective is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. I think it's important to remember, certainly in Canada and the United States, that Canada was built on the violent dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples. It was enforced in Canada through something called the Indian Act, where a legislation was put in place that took away our rights as Indigenous people. In fact, in our Indian Act, it says a person is anything other than an Indian. And so we're talking about justice here. We're talking about social justice. And one of the ways you take away somebody's justice or you rationalize that is by taking away their humanity, something that was supported in things like the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, where the justification for the genocide of Indigenous people was defined, justified, and acted upon. In Canada, we've gone through quite a journey towards trying to move towards reconciliation. I think one of the most profound steps happened in 2015 with the release of the Truth and Reconciliation report that set out very clear calls to action to achieve reconciliation in Canada. And at the core, at the center of the Truth and Reconciliation report was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, an international human rights declaration that was developed in consultation with Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals and civil society that set out a declaration of minimum human rights, because it was recognized that around the world that the violation of minimum human rights standards of Indigenous people was so normalized that it required a declaration. And when we talk about the declaration, these are minimum human rights: the right to speak your language, the right to look after your children, the right to self-determination, the right to have free, prior, and informed consent about matters relating to your territories. These are minimum human rights anybody, Indigenous or not, requires to live joy. And I've often said, we talk about social justice. Right now we see movements really rising, certainly in the States and Canada. There will never be reconciliation. There will never be reconciliation in the absence of justice, in the absence of ensuring that people have what they need to ensure that all people have their minimum human rights met. I know today we're talking about broadband, and like Bryan, this is certainly not an area of expertise, so I'm not even going to pretend to fake it, because I can't even bake it. That's how much it's not my area of expertise, which I shared the other day. But this is what I can tell you, is that right now in the world, everything is dependent on technology. It's a human rights matter. I know in Canada, there's many remote communities that don't have access to broadband. Right now, in the middle of a pandemic, even kids going to school requires some level of technology. But it's not just remote communities, it's not just broadband, it's about the impacts of poverty on ensuring people have that basic human right: access to a telephone, access to a computer, access to a tablet, for example, so that they can actually get educated along with their classmates. A failure to do so, certainly with communities that have experienced racialized and cultural violence that has been legislated, as it has both in Canada and the US, will continue to perpetrate acts of willful human rights violations against Indigenous peoples. So I know I only have 5 minutes. I've taken 6. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm really looking forward to questions and also listening to what the other panelists have to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leah. And I think we're going to go to Traci next, who's going to sort of bridge from where you left off and then into the chaos that is my realm.
We can tell by the Millennium Falcon behind you. So thank you, Leah. I'm excited that you're on this panel, because I don't think we end up globalizing things quite enough. And the thought of to me, the thought of broadband as a human right seems appropriate, but out of my grasp. I think that we fight right now because broadband really is a utility, although it's not regulated as such, and it'll never get classified as such. But it is the underlying framework of our world now, from education to healthcare, telehealth, energy, governance. You know, it's so the thought of it being a human right, it should be, but it seems out of our grasp because, you know, especially in Indian country, that when you talk about communities not having connectivity, we did a study that we released in the fall, a tribal technology assessment, and we found that 18% of tribal reservation residents have no access at home to either wireless or land-based connectivity, and that 33% rely on internet service from a smartphone at home, but the reliability of a smartphone internet connection is questionable. I mean, has anybody tried to do one of these Zooms on a phone? It's not exactly easy. 31% of our respondents stated that their connection was spotty. And these findings just emphasize the need for in-home high-speed broadband for tribal residents in a place where public Wi-Fi is not always an option, even under normal circumstances. And in Arizona alone, 162,000 plus people living on tribal lands, or 95% are either unserved or underserved for telecommunications. This is pre-COVID. This study came out in September. So this was done, you know, the research beforehand. And COVID just exacerbated everything. I think, you know, we always knew there was digital divide. Matt and other colleagues working in that arena. And the digital divide can mean everything too, from no access to the internet to not knowing how to use the internet. I mean, it's a broad gamut of things, but access to the internet alone, we have to have it in this day and age. And so when COVID hit and we had a week to switch everything and all of our teaching and such to the internet, it was amazing that we were able to do so. And we did do so, but we found a lot of things that it wasn't just an Indian country that had no connection. I know anecdotally, we talked to some of our students and we found that there was a lot of folks that just weren't getting it at home because it was everywhere. They just didn't buy it at home because it was at the coffee shops and, you know, it was on campus everywhere where it was ubiquitous, so they didn't need to have it at home. And so we found that it was a lot broader than we expected. In fact, I sit on a task force for the state of Arizona's superintendent of schools about crossing the digital divide. And we're trying to solve this right now because we're entering the school year and we're not sure how that's going to look going back to school, but we still haven't solved that problem. So it's a really big issue. But we have some really significant opportunities right now in front of us here in the States. And right now, this can help us solve the digital divide. And it's kind of funny because when we were talking the other day, Leah was talking about it being a human right. But I often think of access to broadband as a sovereignty issue, and it's sovereignty in action. And tribes that have created their own networks, that's applied sovereignty. And tribes in the United States have sovereignty through our treaty rights. So this option that I'm talking about, I think Matt's going to talk a bit more about it, is an opportunity for Native nations to have spectrum sovereignty and self-governance over their airwaves. And this is the 2.5 gigahertz tribal priority window that the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, has open right now. And through this process, American Indian tribes and states are able to obtain ownership over their airwaves within their tribal boundaries if that is available. However, the digital divide we're trying to cross is impacting tribes' access to application window. And not only that, COVID has really shuttered our economies, and the health issues have, folks are furloughed. And because of this, they haven't had the ability to complete their applications. And these applications are due August 3rd. Like a week and a half away. And we haven't had the number of folks apply that should have been able to apply through this window to solve their issues on their own communities. So this is the work that we do. And we have, for me, it's been really important to be a part of a process where we're part of a solution. I feel like the human rights stuff in the United Nations is so aspirational that I don't know the steps in between to get there. And maybe that's because I just haven't worked in that arena, but this seems concrete. There are steps we can do. And I love working in this arena, and I have great colleagues, and I've had great mentors in this space. And so I'm really thankful to be working here and at ASU, where we have the ability to work with communities to make this happen. So I'm going to wrap up and pitch this to you, Matt, because I think you're going to follow up on what I said.
Great. Thank you very much, Traci. And so we find ourselves in a global pandemic, and unfortunately, it takes a really good disaster to illustrate what the missing components are to a lot of the communities that, you know, people overlook and people assume are connected or assume will be fine without it. And COVID-19 has really illustrated how cut off Indian country is and our rural neighbors, and how much of a disadvantage our school children are, our health systems are, you know, our job pool and unemployment rates are skyrocketing because, you know, furloughs that are happening in off-reservation positions. People are coming home to homes that don't have internet, with, you know, health issues and concerns about the pandemic and no way to communicate. We have several tribes that we've been working with on this specific application window that I'll explain a little bit further, but that the tribal chairpersons don't even have access to a cell signal, so they can't meet with their tribal council to put together the 4 supporting documents that are needed to apply for this option. So it just so happens that this event times out exactly with the awareness campaign that's happening on social media right now for the motion for extension that was filed for the tribal priority window for the first time for tribes to apply for spectrum for broadband use. And this is a full power license. It is 2.5 gigahertz. Sits just above 2.4 gigahertz, which is the space that all of you know as Wi-Fi. And it's a very functional piece of spectrum to build communication infrastructure to your own community. It's also a leverageable, bankable asset to Native American communities. Because we live on sovereign land, our land cannot be collateralized for loans. We can't borrow money against our land as collateral. So this Federal Communication Commission license for spectrum actually gives a strategic advantage to tribes to be able to build out their infrastructure and borrow money against it. So today is the awareness campaign. We launched 2 nights ago the motion for an extension due to COVID interrupting our efforts in getting tribal applications across the finish line with the Federal Communications Commission, and we are asking for a 180-day extension. And the window was 180 days. So why are we asking for a full extension? Well, February 2nd opened the window. August 3rd closes the window. We really had 2 weeks at the beginning of this to work with tribes to get the understanding of what your responsibilities as an FCC license holder are, and the process to navigate the FCC's website to become an applicant and become a license holder. In 2 weeks, COVID hit, widespread, tribes were at risk, started shutting down different areas of the country, and the hardest hit in some, you know, in a lot of cases are the tribal reservations. The numbers are through the roof. And it's based on population, right? It's percentage of population, but we have very small populations. My office is on the Paula Band of Mission Indians Reservation in North County, San Diego, of which they have reported 27 cases, and their population is right around 700 people. So that it's a pretty big hit to that small community. They have not been able to function normal. A lot of tribes haven't been able to function normal. I know the Hopi tribe just had their first tribal meeting, and it was virtual since March. So we've not been able to function in a space where we would normally be able to operate for this 180 days. We haven't gone to our national tribal conventions. We haven't had our gatherings. We haven't had our sharing of information and our face-to-face meetings. And so we're asking for an extension of 180 days to move that out to hopefully be able to conquer some of these problems. Now that we've gotten over some of the first wave of COVID, we're learning how to navigate that and actually be able to work and move into this arena. Now, these are, you know, the ability to apply for this, the opportunity to apply for this. I mean, we're very grateful that this became an opportunity. The tribal priority window was created for this spectrum. And, you know, we're very concerned that the intent was to get tribes to sign up for this, and that COVID is actually stopping that from happening. As of today, we have a little over 80 applications into the system. There were over 500 lands eligible for this. So, you know, to support our tribal and human rights and our right to this spectrum and a right to control the sovereignty of our airwaves, you know, it is imperative that we get an extension and get a fair shake at the opportunity. So hashtag Connect Tribes is the tag that was used today to support this. And we feel that broadband is the way for tribes to stay connected in this future that we live in. And if we don't have broadband, if we aren't involved in the decision-making of how broadband is deployed and created, we're going to be effectively left out of this equation. So I thank you for that, and I'm going to turn it over to Bryan.
Thanks, Matt, and everyone on the panel for being here. You've given me, for me, it's a blessing just to be here because I've learned a bunch. I'm actually going to try to tie some of these things together based on what I know, and I actually want to utilize the word infrastructure to do it. I actually feel like in both Canada and the US, society is currently working the way it's supposed to, or the way it has been designed, not necessarily the way it's supposed to. That's really the issue in question of justice, I think, that Leah has taken us to. But the infrastructure has really been, let me sort of back up and say, I really want to commend to you a piece that recently appeared in Scientific American. It was authored by a woman named Sunny Dooley, who's a medicine woman at Navajo. And part of what Sunny does in her piece is begin to make an argument that says COVID has been as successful as it has been because we have created a society, have created the perfect human being for it. And I think in some ways what we've also done is really create a society, perfect society for Native peoples to not have what they need. That is the infrastructure around health, education, and welfare. So Matt and Traci are really talking about the infrastructure of broadband, and Leah's talking about larger questions of violence, and initially physical violence, not that that's entirely gone away, but certainly other issues of violence become really important here in the form of lack of access to clean water, lack of access to electricity, lack of access to power and to computers, let alone broadband, to be able to take advantage of the broadband. So for me, what's happening here, and I think it's really important, is for us to think about the philosophical responses to this and the urgency of justice that Leah's called us to, and the inherent claims and rights for us to have a just world, but also the practical nature of self-determination that gets captured in larger questions of infrastructure. So let me just say, I think something really important about this, it's interesting because my internet's going in and out. So my photo shows up, my video shows up and not, and I live in an area that has plentiful Wi-Fi and broadband. And today's been one of those days where I just don't have, my access just goes in and out. So it's been a disastrous Zoom day for me, but it's a lesson about folks who don't really have access to those things. I'm fortunate I have a computer. We started a few years ago, I'm going to end with a quick story. We started a online program in indigenous education a few years ago. ASU's been really great about helping us reach people who don't always have access and can't show up to campus. And I had a student, and she'd been participating. Her post had been great. And her papers didn't quite match her post, and then she wrote this final paper, and it was stunning. It's one of the best papers I've ever seen. And I said to her, like, what happened? And she said to me, Well, I borrowed a laptop. I'd been typing everything else on my phone, and it wasn't even a smartphone. It was one of these phones that sort of basically a flip phone to type her work and her papers. And so you sort of realize that there's a whole group of people out there that don't have access to either broadband or to some of those physical manifestations that make success really important in all of this.
Excellent. Thank you, Bryan. So we are about halfway through the hour, and I think we could continue our conversation and pick up points from each other's conversations, but I would like to pose to everyone that's attending this campfire chat to chime in around the campfire and throw in a question into the chat so that we can, take off on a tangent that you're interested in or expand upon, a topic that we may have covered. There's a couple of things, a couple of ways we can go with this. And I think, okay, so we do have a question in the chat. What's going well and what isn't with education, learning, access, and mental health? Would somebody like to take that right out the gate? Traci, do you want to start with that one? And then I'll kind of follow up and share it around.
Where's the question? I didn't see it. It's in the chat.
It's actually, it's to me as a moderator. So,
oh, okay. Read it again.
Yeah. What's going well and what isn't going well with education, learning, access, mental health?
I think what's going well is, God, I hate to use the word resilience because we really are, but it really is. People are adapting to the best of their abilities, whatever that means. I mean, I think of stories where the Tohono O'odham Nation, where they took the Wi-Fi buses out and they had like 20 hotspots and kids could, connect. So, I mean, not that that's the best access, but at least they adapted for the short term. So I think things are going well. I think what's not going well, I can't speak to the mental health things. I can't, that's not my forte. Sure. But I'm always one of those glass half full kind of people. So I do see the resilience in folks. I can't speak to the other. I mean, I think what's not going well is we haven't been able to get to tribes, and what's not going well is when people contact me and say, well, we had this contract to work with a tribe, but we can't get a hold of them. And I'm having to try and explain that folks are at home, they're furloughed, they don't have access, they aren't checking their email. And it just, I don't think that computes to other parts of the country, having to re-explain that over and over, that it really is different. We really are affected in that way. I think that's probably what I would say I deal with the most.
I think tying into a little bit more of the infrastructure, because that's who I am. We've done things like build Wi-Fi drive-ins. We've turned parking lots into drive-ins for access to internet because people don't have access in their homes. We want to deploy broadband to homes, and people are on a waiting list to do that. But with the pandemic, we are concerned about exposing that home to potential virus, or exposing our workers to potential virus, or bringing that virus from home A to home B to home C and actually becoming the cause of part of the spread. So how do you work around that in times like these? And without access to internet, without access to this video channel that we're all looking at each other's faces or still photos, this is some of the little bits of human interaction we get to do today.
Yeah.
Which is so much different than the way it was before. But when you talk about mental health, I mean, this is part of tribal mental health. I mean, we are a face-to-face culture. We are a storytelling oral tradition culture. And Leah, I know you could touch on that oral tradition. So why don't you give a few seconds on that, and then I'll turn it to Bryan to kind of wrap it up with that question.
Sure, Matthew. I just wanted to actually speak to mental health. When you have your human rights violated, it's bad for your mental health. When you're living in overcrowded conditions, I know in Canada, some houses have 20 people living in a house. That's bad for your mental health. When you don't have access to a school, that's not good for your mental health. Poverty, we know through research, is really bad for mental health. much of what we've heard about in COVID, even is it for privileged folks? Messages certainly in Canada have been strong about the importance of social distancing to ensure safety during COVID, frequent hand washing. Well, there's a couple of things you need. First of all, you need a home. I represent a riding, third poorest riding in the country, where my home is surrounded by neighbors who reside in the homeless community around where I live. In many communities in Canada, we have shortages of houses in communities that sometimes are like 600-700 houses, and massive overcrowding. So you can't social distance when you don't have a home. You can't frequently wash your hands when you don't have access to clean drinking water. And going back, these are minimum human rights standards that are not afforded to Indigenous peoples, both in Canada, certainly, and the United States. Arguing that, I would argue that also, certainly in Canada, we're on the 9th non-compliance order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling to immediately stop racially discriminating against First Nations children. That is where our current government, Liberal government, is turning a blind eye. That does not tell kids that they are valued when you willfully, what they said was they were willfully and intentionally violating against the minimum human rights of little children. This is bad for mental health. And the whole piece around, I'm a former educator, actually I taught in the Faculty of Education for a number of years prior to being elected. You know, access to education is a fundamental human right for children. Right now, with the lack of access to technology as a result of issues of poverty, which I feel is a human rights violation, you know, poverty on reserve, these factors in terms of like even technology are bad for mental health. So I'll just leave it at that. That's continually my argument when we pathologize Indigenous people as being, you know, more likely to have mental health. Well, that happens when you go through a violent colonial experience and an ongoing neo-colonial experience where your human rights, minimum human rights, are violated on a every day when you wake up. So I'll leave it at that, but thanks very much.
Excellent, thank you, Leah. Bryan, I'm gonna kind of ask you to answer this one, but drag it into what should a university's role in expanding broadband access to Indigenous people and lessening the digital divide be? So maybe you can kind of draw it into the role of ASU and what they're doing there.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I sort of feel like we could spend the whole hour and then some talking about what's not going well, and I'm not going to linger there. Not because I don't think it's important, but because I think the point's been made, right? The infrastructure is working as it should, and it's broken for Native peoples. What's going well is you have emerging set of Indigenous leaders who are demanding, as others have before them, that their children have rights to not just education, but schooling. And let me just be really clear about what the difference is for me. Schooling is often what happens in school, within four walls, sometimes outside of it, but it's really fundamentally about how people read, write, learn to think in very particular ways that schooling calls for. Education is broader than that. It's the things that we learn in life. It's about education, for me, fundamentally is about preparing young people for the world in which they're going to live. So it goes beyond just the content, in terms of those things. So what's going well is you've got leaders who are demanding and putting into place the capacity for education and schooling. I think Gila River Indian community is actually a really good example of this. They've taken their gaming and other revenues, and they've decided they're not waiting for the federal government anymore. They've built their own school. And that is really an exertion of sovereignty, but it's also fundamentally about self-determination and them saying, we're not going to wait for the government anymore. We're going to hold them responsible, but we're going to build our school, we're going to staff our school, and we're going to engage in the process of self-schooling and self-education in really important ways. I think institutions like ASU and others should be really leading the charge for getting broadband access in the communities. As I said, I love the fact that for me, online education, and lots of academics will say, well, before pre-pandemic would say, it's not a good thing. For me, it's always been an issue of justice, because you reach people who might not normally get reached, who might need to stay at home and not be in residence, but still want the skills and credentials that are there. So if that's going to be on the table and offered, then the means and the mechanism to be able to access it also need to be there. We have unbelievable scientists. We've got people like Lev Gonick who are leading the way in this and really trying to push it. I think one of our roles will be to press government and municipalities to figure out ways to both fund and extend these things into communities for larger society to take, besides ASU, larger society to take a fundamental responsibility for ourselves and for those who may not have access to those things. So yes, we should be in it. Yes, we should be leading it, but we shouldn't be the only ones doing the work. I think it's really important for others to do it as well and go with us as we're potentially building the strategy for that.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I was watching one of Lev's tweets or something at the end of the school year, and there were 60-some thousand ASU students finished the end of the school year online, which is an impressive number of people. But I've got to feel that the tribal component of that number, that greater number, probably suffered greater than everyone else in staying online for the tail end of their semester to finish out their schooling. And I know here in Southern California, you know, the last several weeks of schooling just got dropped because there was nobody that could get online. They sent everybody home to be in online schooling and realized they couldn't get so many of the kids on. They just kind of froze the grades where they were, and kids just processed out from the week where they couldn't get on anymore. So clearly a massive deficit to overcome. Starting San Diego County, starting August 31st, kids will be going back to school online. I have 2 college-age children that are at UC Santa Barbara and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and they've been online for the last quarter and will be online for the foreseeable future. And you know, it's definitely a tough way to learn. It's not how I want to go to higher learning. It's not how I want to do higher education, and I feel it's tough for them to have to do that. Traci, what are you seeing from, you know, AIPI's perspective and you know, some of your team, Bryan, Howard, and folks, as far as, you know, Bryan finishing up his semester online and maybe some of the things that you've heard while working in the space?
So I've been part of a team that was put together to make sure that our Native students transitioned. What y'all may not know is, and Bryan, you should be talking about this, but we have the highest Native student population at any university in the country. I think we run about 3,000 plus. We've got the highest number of Native faculty at around 50-ish at any given time, and we graduate about 300 a semester. So we don't want to lose those students, but I don't know the numbers because I'm not working in the student services support unit of it, but we did spend time working to get folks who were not connected online. I know that Lev was hugely helpful, and as we like single-handedly worked with folks to identify students one by one who didn't have connectivity, to figure out if they were in an area that had cell phone connectivity, and then we were taking them. And then Lev has some app. I don't know what his process was, but he made sure they got a hotspot. And then we also have laptop checkouts. I mean, we really did do everything we could. That being said, we didn't necessarily probably reach everybody because initially students were just surveyed on email. Do you have connectivity? Wait for it, right? You send an email asking folks if they have connectivity, if they got what they need. Well, what happens to the ones who don't respond? Our student support services were great, and they called every student, I think, some of them more than twice. I know at least once or twice for every student as I understood it, but I wasn't an integral part of that team. Now, that being said, I did have, one of my staff members was finishing up his master's in science and technology policy. He was writing his master's thesis, I think, by that point. So, but the graduations going online was very difficult, and it's been difficult on everybody. I mean, I'm not going to say that it wasn't. In fact, I literally still have his graduation present sitting on my desk here because I haven't seen my staff since March, since spring break. Wow. In person. So I think that we worked very hard for our students, and there was a team of us, there's still a team of us that meets weekly. We were meeting 3 times a week at the beginning of this, and we meet weekly now, still trying to make sure that, we're going into the semester in the fall ready for this. We can't leave our Native students behind in this, because I'm so proud that I work at a university that has the highest number of Native students in the country. I graduated with 2 people when I graduated, so to see it change that much, we have to support them. So
we have a question that came through for Bela. Let's see. It basically says several panelists mentioned that most of the people or tribes haven't applied, and it's assumed that they're talking about the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum window. They haven't applied, and why is that? And they haven't applied because a lot of them didn't know about it. The Federal Communications Commission did not do a lot of active engagement with the tribal community. And because we didn't have our national tribal conventions to talk about it, we actually only got out one time at the National Congress of American Indians on October to actually talk about this at length, that there was a window coming and it hadn't opened yet, and we didn't know the rules, but there was something coming. And that's basically all they got at that session. There would have been something like 7 or 8 more tribal conferences, national conferences, that would have happened between now and then, where we would have caught everybody up, and they would have been able to understand what the opportunity was. And the real reason is the majority of them are, like Traci said, she hasn't seen her staff since March. Can you imagine how it is in a rural tribal community where the unknown is truly unknown, and everybody's trying to be safe? So I think that's probably the primary reason. And if the question was directed at people who haven't signed up for broadband that actually have access, cost is typically the barrier to entry. The installation fee, the monthly fee, and just the general, yet another thing that has to be paid for every single month. Do I pay for food or do I pay for internet? And sometimes it comes down to that choice. And obviously, I'm going to pick food, and I'm sure most of you will as well. So, that is really a struggle in Indian country is affordability, and so even the affordability programs are at the risk of denting the pocketbook on some 55% unemployment on average. It makes it very tough. So I wanted to bring Leah back into the conversation. Leah, I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, but do you know, with the use of broadband, does broadband provide any tools for the fight that you're fighting? Is there a group of resources online that help the community heal and help the community get in touch with each other to heal from the issues that you're dealing with in your?
Well, I think absolutely. Like, if you look, certainly in terms of social movements in the past, particularly with media bias, social media certainly has totally changed the discussion, and it certainly has allowed individuals connect, certainly across Canada, but around the world. And I think what it's doing is it's uniting Indigenous people globally in a fight for justice and a fight for human rights. And I do include in that access to the same resources that are afforded to other groups of peoples, and that includes access to technology. These are minimum human rights that are certainly articulated through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, in many articles in terms of equity of access to technology. I know, there are communities in Canada that have really virtually no internet access, no broadband. But I also know many communities, certainly in northern Manitoba, although northern Manitoba is the second poorest riding in the country, that they have improved somewhat on connectivity, and that makes a big difference. It causes serious issues in a world that is dependent on technology, to not have access to that technology, even around healthcare, whether it be healthcare, education. And so absolutely, I think it's making a big difference. I think it certainly has advanced many difficult discussions that we're having now internationally, in terms of the rights of the BIPOC individuals globally. And I use it. I'm terrible with it, but it's certainly one of the tools that I use, different tools, different platforms, to certainly advance my own message locally, and like I said, nationally and internationally.
So follow up to that, do you find social media platforms in the general public to be harmful for conversations like this? And do you take those into private rooms or private opportunities through social media so you're not engaging with the ignorant public, if you will?
I'm very public. Like I take very progressive, bold stands. I'm, a self-declared socialist in Canada. I take very progressive stands, and I actually haven't had a lot of pushback. I'm often asked that, and you would think with some of the positions, which I don't find radical, they're human rights positions that I've taken so far, you would think I would get pushback, but I actually haven't. I think the world is changing right now, and I think the state certainly was an example of that. And I don't want to get into US politics on here, but you certainly have leadership that's on very, very different. Certainly, you see a Bernie Sanders and some of the values that Trump has, and they're polar opposites. And I think that's very much what's happening around the world, including in Canada. So, and I have my perspectives, but it's actually been a very useful platform. And I think the only way you achieve social justice or reconciliation is if you're willing to have difficult discussions, and you're willing to have pushback, and I'm willing to have that. So it's actually been very positive for me, knock on wood. It might not stay that way, but so far, even as an elected official, it's been really good for me.
Excellent. So we had a question in the chat on how do we get a hold of our projects? How can we learn more about your projects? And we've posted a lot of links to us and to some of the different things that we're involved with in the chat. And then I think what we'll do now, we have 6 or 7 minutes left in the hour. I'd like to kind of close out with each person to find out if there's one last thing they wanted to round out this conversation with and leave as a nugget of value for folks. We'll start with Bryan.
Thanks. Just to reiterate how thankful I am to be learning from you all, I want to reiterate some of what Leah said and others have said, which is really education and schooling for Indigenous peoples need to be a human right. And I think that thinking about what kind of infrastructure gets built to start that process, but then once that process gets started, really thinking about then how do we begin to impact and change and alter the infrastructure. So I started really with saying the infrastructure of the U.S. works the way it should. For me, there's some encouragement in us really beginning to reimagine what a new infrastructure might look like to be able to serve all peoples.
Excellent. Traci, closing statement?
I would follow up and say, I think the reason that I do this is for the same reasons that Bryan does this. I mean, I love the policy end of it, but the reality is I'm at the university because we need folks that do this. We need folks that that know this, that understand this. I'm working to build the pipeline of folks that understand this, that want to work on building this infrastructure, that want to do the policy around this infrastructure. We don't have even the people to hire in this expertise. We don't even have people to hire because there's just so few folks doing it. So I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be. And I appreciate the people like Bryan, who give me tremendous advice, and Lev, who does these crazy things like this, and Matt, who advises me, and getting to meet people like Leah. So we got to build that pipeline, and we need the infrastructure to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Traci. Leah, a couple minutes on the close for you.
Sure. Thanks very much. First, I want to start out by thanking Lev Gonick for initially inviting me to this campfire session. I've known Lev since I was a little girl. When he was living in Winnipeg, our families were very close. So I grew up with Lev's family. So I really appreciate the invitation here. And it was a real privilege to be Canadian on a panel of very distinguished Americans on the panel as your Canadian neighbor today. So thank you. I learned a great deal. I just wanted to end off with Jerry Springer, for those of you who remember Jerry, final thought. I know that's not a good, but it's the Jerry Springer final thought from Gazan. And here it is. So I shared this the other day when I was talking about a community, a beautiful, beautiful nation called Haida Gwaii in British Columbia, who is currently trying to protect their community from tourists to keep their community safe from COVID. And I was quite upset with what was going on and the silence. And this is what I said: it is not okay to support human rights when it suits your economic and political agenda and then stay silent when it doesn't. Human rights should never be up for debate. We must stay vigilant to uphold and respect human rights for all at all times. So it was really wonderful to be with you around this campfire, to talk about human rights, to talk about how we can build a better world for all. So thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Leah. And I'll just close with saying that, so I'm a recovering graphic designer, and I think I've found something better. I was making people happy one greeting card at a time for BlueMountain.com. I learned technology. I embraced technology. I'm a creative individual, jack of all trades, master of none. And I got an opportunity to come to work with the tribes in Southern California. And I really kind of felt this was a place where some of my skill set would help this community grow. And my passion and my drive, and my friend Jeffrey Blackwell called me a cyber warrior for tribal broadband, and I embraced that to the fullest. I, like Traci, am just about half Norwegian, and I embrace that Viking look as well. So I'm fighting for people to have the tools to make it in this era that we're in, and right now they don't have those tools. So my goal is to make sure that the tribal communities and those left behind get the access to the tools that they need to be on a level playing field today. So I appreciate your time today and you listening to us for an hour. And it was nice to sit around the campfire with you, even though I'm in outer space in the Millennium Falcon. Appreciate you all. Thank you very much.